From its reasonable roots, criminal naivete has regrettably bastardized the due process model of the justice system in important ways. It has progressed to such an absurd degree that criminals are now viewed favorably and the system is viewed unfavorably, a situation we explore at length as the Great Inversion.
I call myself a prison abolitionist, therefore believe that prison, it's just repurposed slavery with extra steps.
In college, on the internet, in the public space, it is super common to hear people repeat slogans, single sentence summaries of the way things be that really only make sense on a cardboard sign at a rally, but fall apart anytime you apply any scrutiny to them. There's a robust amount of data on all of this that's available to anyone, and the things they say are so egregious that they can only be described as an inversion of that picture that the data paints. And this brings up a very important question. In the face of this unprecedented amount of data, how is it that so many people whose literal job is to concern themselves with the statistics of crime get it so fucking wrong? So we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to talk about how people thought about crime throughout history. We're going to talk about what progressives believe today. We're going to show in no uncertain terms what the data actually demonstrates. And then we're going to talk about why this inverted view of crime not only exists, but it is so rampant through so many institutions. If you don't know me, my name's Alex Bromley. I've had some success on YouTube with a lifting related channel. And after so many years of putting together essays, I am using those skills to further flood your feed with my opinions about things that I'm sure you are desperately interested in. And in covering some of these controversial topics, I wish I could sit here and tell you I'm not biased, I'm giving you the straight scoop, but of course I'm biased. Of course I'm coming to you with my own experiences and perspectives, but my hope is that through thorough research and through providing an ample amount of data as well as stress testing my own assumptions, that you and I can get closer to the truth together. And guys, this video is brought to you by Barbell Apparel. There is no more comfortable clothing attire for overweight pseudo-intellectual meatheads such as myself. As I'm filming in my garage office in Arizona in summer, this clothing is keeping me cool and comfortable. So hit the link below, check it out. Instead of droning on in a monotone fashion for an hour and a half covering every nook and cranny of the history of crime and punishment, let's speedrun this bitch. First, you had early attempts at crime like the laws of Hammurabi in somewhere around 1700 BC, where yes, deterrence was always baked in. I mean, even a caveman knows that if the child tries to reach for the dinosaur meat in the fire, you slap his hand so he doesn't do it again. Dogs know that you express aggressive behavior to prevent some further action from happening. And if you cut off a thief's hand, it is so that thieving in the future is harder. And you say to the other thieves, hey, if you like wearing bracelets, maybe you leave the gold and silver goods with the shopkeeper where it belongs. But there was also a bunch of other shit baked in, a general sense of what justice was, balance, the biblical eye for an eye. And that's how you get such gems like if a builder builds a house shittily and it falls and kills the owner, you put him to death. It's kind of harsh, but I get it. There's some logic there. But then you also get, well, if it kills the owner's son, you kill the builder's son. I don't know about that one, Chief. I feel like we lost the plot a little bit. Then you move into the Enlightenment and people are like, we could probably do better. Not just because it's kinder, but we could probably do a better job of preventing crime. And you would have Enlightenment era thinkers develop the classical school of criminology, which basically says from a biblical standpoint, God endowed us with free will. Human beings are rational thinkers. We're responsible for our actions and we're all entitled to some amount of human rights. So let's not be dicks about it. Now, when you have free will, everybody's redeemable. Praise Jesus. But also, you're responsible for everything you do, so you can be punished up to and including an eternity spent in a lake of hellfire. And you might be asking questions like, what happens if somebody is mentally incapacitated? What if they have a disorder? What if they were born in just shit circumstances where breaking the law was really the only option to them? And this important line of questioning is going to show a very vital truth of all of the schools that we're about to cover. History is almost entirely punctuated by movements, and movements are entirely constructed of people that sincerely overvalue any one singular reductionist explanation. Fine print, caveats, well, it depends. None of that goes good on a cardboard sign. So we're going to see schools of thought that almost entirely overvalue any one of three perspectives, where you treat people as rational agents with free will, you treat them as just an inevitable conclusion of their biology, or you treat them as completely blank slates who are infinitely influenced by the environment around them. Now, as we move past the Enlightenment, as science continues to become all the rage, you have people lean into biological explanations as the ultimate determination of how you are going to end up in your life. Cesar Lombroso would super lean into your grandfather's "you people" rhetoric and describe what he called a delinquente nato. That's not what Trump is doing with our international allies. That's a type of born criminal, somebody that he described as an evolutionary throwback, and because everything's derived from genetics, he would expect there to be an association between certain features and criminal activity, and he ended up measuring traits that he thought were consistent: hooked noses, misshapen ears, jaw protrusions, asymmetries in the face. And he would even go on to quantify things like shifty eyes and scanty hair and too many tattoos. So his brilliant contribution was to look out for people that look like the bad guys in 1920 silent films. I don't know, I guess before silent films that was kind of revolutionary. And as much as people cringe at this type of research today, he would look at things like personality traits and beliefs as part of his profile that actually would become very important in the future. So we've gone from eye for an eye with Hammurabi all the way to free will and being humane with our treatment of criminals, all the way over to actually criminals are derived entirely from their genetics, and you can tell them by this picture I drew of them. Now let's go do a eugenics and problem solved. Now, certain people would not be satisfied with the gloomy reductionist view that you are simply just the inevitable expression of your genes, so they would look to construct another reductionist explanation for why crime exists: social structures and power dynamics. And that brings us to the fathers of sociology. You have Karl Marx, who we all know and love, and peers like Emil Durkheim, and they would start their critique of society. And those critiques and assumptions would serve as the axiomatic bedrock for the entire field of sociology as it began to bud as an academic field. Most people associate Karl Marx with communism, and while that's not incorrect, Marxism in general is a description, a critique of society through the power dynamics that exist through the haves and the have-nots. Basically, the haves have all the means of production, the people on the bottom end up having to sell their labor for wages, and it creates this really negative outcome where people experience alienation, and so much of societal ills can be attributed to this, in his mind, completely corrupt relationship. Emil Durkheim, a peer of Marx, would coin the term anomie, which pops up quite a bit in criminological texts. It refers to a lack of social norms driven by industrialization and rapid population growth that leads to a breakdown of understanding. That actually sounds reasonable. I believe that tight-knit communities with high standards and clear communication of those standards are absolutely integral to getting a better outcome and reducing crime. And I can even view growing up in such a society as a type of privilege. Oh, what's that, Emil? The authority which the moral conscience enjoys must not be excessive, otherwise no one would dare to criticize it. To make progress, individual originality must be able to express itself. Even the originality of the criminal shall also be possible. Durkheim viewed deviance as fundamental and essential to society, something you almost couldn't remove. And in this weird way where I guess you can't have good without evil, so evil is kind of good. So we're in the 1800s and we're already at the stage of what even is crime? Like I said at the beginning, these movements are almost entirely defined by people that overvalue one particular perspective and just drive it until the fucking wheels fall off. Durkheim is starting to do it here, and throughout the 1900s, socialists, Marxists, and postmodernists are all going to do the exact same thing. In the 1930s, we'd get Merton's strain theory, which just said, hey, crime happens because there's these culturally valued goals that you can't get. And again, while that sounds reasonable, he's not even talking about the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy like food and fucking shelter. He's talking about shit relative to the people around you. And this would be the beginning of my favorite buzzword, inequity, because it's not that you're actually struggling to survive. It's that the guy over there has more than you, and that shit ain't right. Why am I letting that stand? And what makes a socially valued goal viable in the first place? Is it what the individual thinks, his community thinks? What if those goals are actually dysfunctional in and of themselves? What if the person has fucking personality disorder and their valued goals are actually insane? There's a lot of questions to unpack, and we're not quite there yet. And speaking of more people taking one perspective and running it off a cliff, you have the behaviorists in psychology in the mid-1900s, like B.F. Skinner, who were entirely obsessed with operant conditioning. Basically, they recognized that if you manipulated punishments and rewards, you could get people to do like whatever the fuck you wanted. So then you have geniuses like John B. Watson, who again would go all in on his pet theory, saying, give me a dozen healthy infants and I'll guarantee to take anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. I think even the most sheltered, privileged, first world leftist college goer wouldn't quite sign off on that statement. However, all of this would be fuel for sociology, which was desperate to deliver on the promise of Marx that everything was in fact a byproduct of environment and the structure of power that existed therein. If you had any explanation that minimized the role of the individual at any level, whether it be free will or biology, and placed it at the feet of their environment, specifically the social structures of power that made up society, you better believe the sociologists were going to take it, frame it, put it on their wall. So now we're going to take all of these influential human beings and connect them ass to mouth in a human centipede daisy chain that is leftist critical thinking. Let's get into what progressives actually believe on the subject. In the mid-1900s, all of these things would converge to create the rise of the critical theories. Many people associate it with race, but you can apply it to anything. Critical theories tend to be kind of a mishmash of Marxist and postmodernist views. We covered Marxism just generally asks who controls the means of power. Those are the haves, those are the enemies. Postmodernism asks who controls truth and meaning. And if you've ever tried to crack a postmodernist philosophy book, God bless you, you were doomed from the start. The result of the millions of words from mid-century academics who did not write to be understood is that many people just came to believe it's a complex topic to understand. And it's not. These people were just expert fart sniffers. When you think of modernists, think of, I don't know, like the Jetsons or some near sci-fi future. Modernism you can think of as science-based. You believe there's an objective reality, science is going to get you there. Postmodernist is like, yeah, but what about my fifis? I told you I was biased. Yes, that is a very condescending way for me to describe what postmodernism is. The charitable way is to talk about it as building off of Marxist critiques of power structures in society, but instead of looking at the means of production and economic variables, you're looking at things like language. You're looking at things like how the people in charge, the lawmakers, the wealthy, how they set laws, how they establish standards, and how all of their biases are packaged in those standards. And if you decide to accept it as truth, you are thereby validating their perspective as being real over yours. Once again, that almost sounds reasonable. In fact, it seems like unnecessary amount of skepticism that would be required to check our linguistic assumptions so that we could in fact be more clear about what we're talking about, get on the same page, and get closer to objective truth. I mean, I bet scientists just love postmodernism until you realize that what I just described there is a constructive act. You actually have to have something concrete to put your values around if you want to build something up that's sustainable. Postmodernists and subsequent critical theorists do not give a fuck about that. They realize that deconstructing truth is a lot of fun and an easy way to, if not outright win an argument, at least just frustrate the piss out of your opponent. They don't operate like engineers. They operate like the demo expert that is taking down a skyscraper so that when there's nothing but rubble and smoke left, a bystander walks up and says, what's going to go up after this? The critical explosives expert is going to shrug their shoulders and say, fuck if I know, my job's done. And I'm going to get off on a rant here, but this is what describes a typical postmodernist today. It is a college student who learned very quickly once they got into their college courses that moral relativism and lived experiences actually kind of means that you can take all of your beliefs about the world, hold them as being just as true as anybody else's, and if anybody disagrees with you, you can just deconstruct the absolute shit out of their worldview by asking why over and over and over until eventually you hit their philosophical bedrock, that last axiomatic belief that you just believe for the sake of it, because you have to believe in something at the bottom for anything to stand on top of it. And once you get to that last fatal why, their worldview is going to be reduced to rubble, and they're going to be left floating around in the ether of meaning and ideas, unable to attach it to anything tangible.
Why? Well, because some things are and some things are not. Why? Well, because things that are not can't be. Why? Because then nothing wouldn't be. Why? I'll fuck you, eat your french fries, you little shit, god damn it.
They're going to be stunned so much that they're not going to notice what you're doing, which is actually Trojan horsing in your own beliefs and hoping that nobody fucking notices. The philosopher Habermas used the term cryptonormativity to describe the king of postmodernism and moral relativism, Michel Foucault, who was so good at deconstructing social power structures that he realized that crime and insanity, these are just arbitrary terms that the people in power defined, and we just like accept it, man. According to Foucault, psychology will never be able to tell the truth about madness, because it is madness that holds the truth of psychology. God, I fucking love intellectuals. They never miss. Write that shit in cursive on a cutting board and hang it above your bed in your dorm. That is the 19-year-old college philosophy major's equivalent of live, laugh, love. But Foucault was also a fucking activist. He also had his beliefs as to what was right and wrong. So let me get this straight. You can deconstruct shit like murder and robbery as being arbitrary constructs, but whatever bullshit pops in your head that makes your heart rate go up, that gives you a rumbly tummy, no, that is actually firm grounding to build an activist cause off of. He, just like every other postmodernist activist, has a metric fuck ton of strong normative beliefs hiding deep around in their belly that motivates all of their actions, but his deconstruction has to be focused on his opponent, never himself, or else he'll be left floating around in the ether of meaning, unable to grab onto anything concrete, just like the person he's arguing against. And that's not acceptable. So we just got to put a big heavy blanket over our normative beliefs. Just hope nobody notices. And if you do your demo work right, the person you're arguing against is going to be too disoriented to notice the absolute hypocritical bullshit of a moral relativist insisting that you have to adopt their beliefs on things like race and gender and the economy in order to be a good person. What the fuck does any of this have to do with criminology? I'm glad you asked. This is the ideological underpinning of everything that modern leftists and progressives believe when it comes to crime. Every single social problem you can point to by default in their worldview is an inevitable conclusion of the power structures that exist in society with regards to economic conditions and your identity. As you move through all the hippie bullshit in the 1960s, you would get leftist idealist criminology or critical criminology. So if the rich and the privileged are bad, then rich crimes are actually really bad and harm everybody. But the poor or working class are victims, which makes them good. So street crime, even violent street crime, must be either A, not real, it's just the bourgeoisie in a moral panic so they can justify implementing more authoritarian laws, or B, an actual act of rebellion. It's part of a necessary system. See, Durkheim said it's fundamental. They're just sticking their fist up, sticking it to the man. They're just vocalizing their discontent. You see people take someone like Martin Luther King, who is able to inspire a movement through civil disobedience and nonviolent principles and repurpose his writings, posting things all over Instagram like riots are the voice of the unheard, to give some posthumous co-signing of tearing down stores, burning down cities because you're mad. And so focused were they on capitalist explanations to describe why anything went wrong ever, they actually treated any participation with the criminal justice system as some type of co-signing of it as being a legitimate system and not just a corrupt entity. It was somehow like helping to grease the wheel that was crushing you. Now, thankfully, there were still some adults in the room who were busy poring over data and trying to come up with solutions while all of their comrades were out drinking and holding cardboard signs in the fucking street. And they hit on a very important note. When poor people tend to rob or stab somebody, it tends to be other poor people. So maybe we shouldn't make murderers, rapists, and robbers the face of our economic cause. We'd get a minor correction. Through the 80s and 90s, we would get criminologists that were still on the left, but they were left realists, meaning they acknowledged that crime needed to be taken care of. You had the likes of John Lay and Jock Young, who created a square of crime, looking at offenders, victims, state agencies, and communities as a corner of the square, and any change to one was going to mess with the whole shebang. So it's supposed to be more of a complete explanation because they're rejecting single causes. However, under the offender corner, they still firmly put marginalization and economic deprivation. You have what looks like a very complex and fleshed out theory, taking into account all of these different dynamics, but off the table are individual variables, including biology, including psychological issues, personality disorder, psychopathy. The offender is by default marginalized and deprived, but the complexity of the system is really just left idealism with extra steps. As Jock Young would go on to write, the result of images of wealth and celebrity lifestyles is widespread enemy, resentment, and crime, not just for material gain, but for emotional release, identity, or temporary escape from the contradictions of modern life. Now, I've always said that one of the worst things that happen to our criminal justice system is cops going off the air. I remember growing up, getting a firsthand POV view of what it was like to be a cop, dealing with the worst dregs of society. But thankfully, in 2026, we have a brand new economy on YouTube that is driven entirely by body cam footage. And because you don't need a camera crew to follow you around, we get a lot more of the nitty gritty. Now, you can go watch any one of these channels, see what happens when a regular ass cop interacts with a regular ass perp, and ask yourself, does this seem like it's for emotional release, identity, or temporary escape from the contradictions of modern life? Or does this just seem like the bottom 1% of society that's driven by drug use, psychological issues, or having grown up in a family and culture of rampant dysfunction? Now, the difference is, while I think those factors are absolutely at the center, I will also accept other explanations as being relevant factors, but the leftists will only accept this fruity, poetic butt fingering as an explanation for why somebody would beat their wife, shoot their neighbor, stab a child, or even do something more pathetic, like go to prison because they were at a McDonald's and they tried to fill the water cup with a soda, and you've done it 5 times that week, so they call the cops on you. And when the cops tell you to leave, you say no, and then you end up fighting with the cops, and eventually you get a felony. Now, as animated as I'm getting, I understand that this is careful ground we have to tread, because I'm starting to build a narrative that they are not quite like you. And if you're not very clear about how you communicate this, people can take that and run to really stupid, and I would even say evil places with it. So let me take a second to break this down. So let's dig into what the data actually says, what multiple disciplines have to say about the nature of criminal behavior, so that we can get a very clear idea of what it means when we say they, and to what degree they are or are not different from you and me. First, let's start with the distribution of crime. A lot of people already know this. Very, very few people commit overwhelmingly a large amount of crime.
Every year in the United States, somewhere around 2% of US counties are going to see about 50% of US murders. About 60% of US counties are not going to see any murders in a given year. In my home city of New York, 3.5% of our street segments see about 50% of all the violent crime.
And people will hear that very little and they'll think, oh, well, it's Black people. Black people commit a lot of crime per capita relative to all other groups. Or they'll think it's poor people. A leftist will hear it and be like, yeah, it's the poor. So that's the bottommost group of poor people. And it actually doesn't quite work out that way, because whatever population you zoom in on, a very small chunk of that population is going to be responsible for most of the bullshit. That's true in whites, Hispanics, blacks. That's true in wealthy and poor. That's true in prison.
We see the Pareto principle really intensified in prisons, where you have quite literally 1% to 2% of the population that are committing over 50 to 60% of the misconduct, including violence.
If you go into any penitentiary, most of the violence overwhelmingly is from a very small group of hyper-violent offenders. There was one longitudinal study in Philadelphia. I fucking hate that word, longitudinal. It just means you measure something over a period of time and you take measurements at regular intervals. I don't think there's another word that adequately says that, so I'm stuck saying fucking longitudinal. But researchers tracked all males born in Philadelphia in 1945, almost 10,000 males, up until the age of 18. And what they found is that out of that group of everyone born in 1945, only 6% of the cohort committed 52% of all delinquent offenses. This 6% of the group were chronic offenders. Each one had at minimum 5 interactions with police. Now, if I completely inverted this and said 6% of the population controls 52% of the wealth, many people watching this video would lose their shit and say, we gotta get rid of the 6%. Come, comrade, we must start a revolution against the bourgeoisie. Is there any similar empathy for billionaires? Anybody like, yeah, Scrooge McDuck? I mean, it's his upbringing. His parents instilled those values. He lived in a bubble. He's really not connected to the rest of humanity. It's not his fault. Let's cut him a break. No, people want their heads on a fucking stick. But when you have people out there preying on society, making subways unsafe, committing robbery, sexual assaults, all of the firearm deaths that are responsible for anti-Second Amendment movements are from a very small chunk of the population, and we're supposed to have a lot more empathy and really go the long way around to deal with them. 100%, I'm in the biased side of my brain right now. I'm not saying put their heads on a stick, but I am pointing out a clear difference in how we view evildoers based on our own biases and assumptions of what constitutes somebody being bad. If rich is bad, we can allow for wealthy people to be evil. But if poor means victim, which means good, you can never hold somebody at the bottom accountable for their actions or even address a rampant disparity like 6% of people born in an entire year in a major city, committing over half the offenses. Now, as if that wasn't bad enough, they were responsible for even higher shares of serious crimes, 71% of homicides, 73% of rapes. And this ties into an important feature of crime, and that is that violence is fundamentally different as a type of crime than something like property crime. And as a trait in the people that commit it, it is wildly more persistent. Now, part of that might be for personality traits. Some of it might be environmental, like organized crime. From the book Criminal Naivete, the Chicago Inmate Survey is a cohort of gun offenders recently incarcerated for violent gun crimes, including murder, armed robbery, and armed habitual criminality. Roughly 93% of these participants are gang members, 95% have 5 or more arrests, which is the standard criterion for career criminality, and nearly 2/3 have 15 or more arrests, even though the average age is only 28. This dispels the myth that people are tripping and getting felonies for bullshit causes. The overwhelming majority of people in prison, especially for violent crimes, represent a very, very small group of repeat offenders. And this isn't just in the United States, folks. This is international. A Swedish national study on violent crime convictions, Falk et al. 2013, analyzed the entire population of Sweden, 2.4 million people born 1958 to 1979. And if we're looking at 63% of convictions for violent crimes in Sweden from that cohort, what percentage do you think was responsible? 6%? 4%? In this study, 1%. Out of 2.4 million people, there were 24,342 persistent violent offenders that made up damn near 2/3 of all violent crimes. Persistence in violence is associated with being male. It's not surprising to anybody, but also having a personality disorder and having a violent crime conviction before the age of 19. This also showed to be true in a UK offender cohort. So now we're just talking about a group of offenders. Of the entire group, and these are already criminals that we're selecting for, 5% of the cohort became chronic offenders, having 15 or more proven offenses. That doesn't include the dark figure of crime, which is estimated between 10 all the way up to 100 times of the actual conviction rate, because it turns out we're just not as good at catching people and prosecuting them for each crime that happens as we would like to believe that we are.
We have about 350,000 unsolved murders in the United States. Today, about half of murders are cleared by arrest, the others remain unsolved. And in large cities, I'm from Akron, Ohio, in Cleveland, 11% of the murders are cleared by arrest.
Okay, so we know we have this small group of people that are causing most of the problems. The next question is, what do we do about them? You can't answer that question unless you know a thing or two about the psychology of individuals and what their persistence of offense is. How easy is it actually to get in there and course correct to make sure that they choose a different path? Is it even fucking possible? Well, thankfully, there are people that measure consistency across lifespan. There's essentially 3 types of people when it comes to offending. 2/3 are adolescence limited offenders. This is like the boys will be boys, or I remember when I was 16, we, got into some stuff. I remember the shit that I did as a teenager that was stupid until I wisened up, got some responsibility, and got my shit straightened out. And I'm just ready. I got my finger on the trigger for when Teddy is at that age where he's ready to get into some shit. I'm just gonna, like the hand of God, just coming down, ready to make sure he stays on the straight and narrow. This is a very normal thing in societies, but also that is what gives sympathizers a lot of their misgivings about truly pathological criminals. From the book Criminal Naivete, with their nostalgic memories of underage drinking and shoplifting music cassette tapes, the criminally naive project those personal experiences onto serious offenders and believe that their own ephemeral flirtation with crime is identical to those who are currently in jail or prison. Now, another 10% are abstainers. They're the goody two-shoes. They don't get into shit. Think of an Asian kid who gets slapped upside the head by his dad every time he brings home a B+. You think of kids that are just not very social. They're at home playing video games, reading comic books, or they just have an insane amount of awareness and self-control at an age where essentially nobody does. Once again, we have a distribution curve. 2/3 are in the middle, getting into some shit as kids, but they grow out of it and become productive members of society. 10% never get into anything, and that means on the other end, you got this other 10% who are going to be chronic lifetime offenders. Now, 10% sounds like a lot to people. It's the same with IQ. 10% of the population has an IQ low enough to actually prohibit you from certain types of simple labor jobs. Now, part of what skews your idea of how many people people should exist in the population. You're like, there can't be 10%. I engage with hundreds of people every day, and I don't see somebody that meets this criteria. And that's because when somebody is an outlier, they're less likely to be out there in the mix with the general population. The bottom 5% of intelligence are going to be like developmental disabilities, people that have to be conserved. Of course, you don't see them on a day-to-day basis. Similarly with crime, you're not going to see the most violent offenders working middle-class jobs or socializing with the regular population. This is a trait that has an extreme pressure for what your day-to-day is likely to be like.
Those who earn associate's degree in prison have just about a 14% recidivism rate, and that number drops 0% for those who earn a master's degree program.
You're talking about selection bias problem. It doesn't necessarily mean that the educational program itself actually caused the outcome. And I think you see a lot of that same question raised with respect to poverty, right? In the general population here in the United States, something like antisocial personality disorder has a prevalence rate of about 1 to 4%. In prison settings, it's about 40 to 70%. So the question then becomes is someone who is deeply antisocial in their disposition likely to succeed in our economy?
And where previously I mentioned that one of the factors that would determine if somebody was going to be a repeat offender was having committed a violent crime before the age of 19, according to the authors, the 5% most behaviorally disturbed children in early elementary school are most likely to be chronic offenders decades later. They are almost 20 times more likely to be imprisoned during adulthood, a status significantly predicted by their early childhood conduct. That's not to say that there is no flexibility with the life course of these individuals, but it is to say that the bottom group that we're talking about has an incredibly persistent pattern of behavior that is not easily curbed. It is not unlike when you're trying to treat addicts. Look, mental health is a family business in more ways than one. My wife is a therapist and social worker. I myself ran a behavioral health group out of my gym twice a week for 5 years. But we've got experience on both sides of the aisle. My father was a psychiatrist, but he was also a pill addict who got his license pulled. I could point to my brother. I had a family member go to the actual Betty Ford clinic. I've been to Al-Anon. I've been to these support meetings. Anybody with any tangential experience with addiction knows that you can throw all the money in the world at it. You're not going to raise the rates of people staying on the straight and narrow. Relapses are still guaranteed. The pattern of addiction is extraordinarily fixed. That doesn't mean we don't stop trying to find better ways to move it forward, but it does mean that we can't be naive little bitches and assume that wherever somebody relapses, oh my God, it must be their childhood. They need more therapy. They need more $20,000 stays at expensive rehab clinics. We need more funding for schools. We need this, that, or the other thing. Sometimes you have to accept that humans are kind of fucked up, and we have to use the means at our disposal in order to protect the population at large. So it doesn't matter if you had some unfair affliction of alcoholism. If you've wrecked your car 5 times while being intoxicated, off to the penitentiary you go. There's a point where you have a flock of sheep, and if the wolves keep tearing up your sheep, you don't stop and ask, but why is the wolf this way? It's not fair the wolf was born a wolf in an era where farmers have guns. It's not really fair, but it's a reality, and you have the right to protect yourself and your flock without having to have supreme godlike control over the developmental stages of predators. Yes, that was a biased rant. Do I need to hold up my hand? I'm gonna get like a red paddle. This is the preempt to the, well, that's just your opinion, man. I'm gonna hold this up every time I say something that is not just data. Yes, this is a pickleball paddle. No, you will never see footage of me playing pickleball. Now, there's some other data that we have to get into because it directly addresses a long-held belief from progressives that poverty or inequality, depending on which side of the bed they woke up on that day, is the primary driver of crime. They see the economic conditions being different, make assumptions about the lack of power and influence they've had in their lives and how that steered their life towards a less desirable course. So criminality is just an expression of unfair circumstances and not having the same as everybody else. And that is just another way that leftists tend to make criminals the victims, which in their worldview also makes them the hero. Oh, sorry. Now, this is one of the easiest ones to talk about because we just have a ton of examples of poverty and crime not exactly coinciding. So you see the graph of ice cream sales going up and then it's followed by a spike in shark attacks. You don't think, hey, shark attacks are caused by ice cream sales. However, you wouldn't even get to that conclusion if only like a third of the graphs showed that correlation in the first place. The 1960s economic boom, violent crime exploded. Homicides were up 70%, general crime index up 140%, during a time of low unemployment and relative prosperity. In the Great Recession 2007, violent and most property crime fell nationwide, while poverty and unemployment spiked. I'm sure there's going to be people in the comments typing all kinds of context as to why no, that actually doesn't disprove our model. Well, after you address that, go ahead and address this. Consider what poverty actually means. It's a struggle for survival. We have an arbitrary number that represents poverty, but it doesn't take into effect that if you can't afford food, the government gives you money for food. If you can't afford housing, government gives you subsidies for housing. There are all kinds of amenities that come with living in most cities in the United States that don't get factored into somebody's actual state of poverty in relation to places where none of those amenities exist. Take what was formerly known as Calcutta, which has extreme poverty. People in small crowded makeshift housing, no real sanitation, no indoor plumbing, electrical grids are lacking, still suffering from stunted growth due to malnutrition as a child, and infants regularly dying of preventable issues like diarrhea. Life in that area was poor in the truest sense of the word, an actual struggle for survival, yet their murder rate was between 1 and 3 for every 100,000. In 1990, the murder rate in New York City was 30 per 100,000. The poorest parts of New York City in 1990 still did not represent the true struggle for survival that a place like Calcutta had. We are not only modern and reap the benefits, the excess of capitalism, but we are a welfare state. The homeless in California are given smartphones, supreme information machines that possess all of the knowledge of mankind. A couple decades ago, this would have been considered magic, and homeless people have access to it. You could also look at other poor countries. Jamaica, for instance, had a murder rate that was anywhere from 5 to 6 times higher than Zimbabwe, despite Zimbabwe having more relative extreme poverty. Of course, other factors, including environmental and structural factors, potentiate violence. But that's actually the point. It isn't sound reasoning to take something as simple and vague as poverty and use that as a default explanation for why crime happens. Places like New York City, just like places like Jamaica, have to be held accountable for the cultures of violence that are allowed to propagate. It's a pretty straightforward question. If people in Zimbabwe can live in relative poverty without killing, raping, preying on each other, why can't people in New York City?
And it's this concept that some of my colleagues have echoed, and that's a phenomenon known as transposing the conditional. You could say, for example, that poverty is a strong predictor of crime. But to get at what Ralph's saying, the vast majority of folks do not commit crime who are in even the most crestfallen of neighborhoods, characterized by the worst levels of disadvantage.
So here my BFF Maddie mentions transposing the conditional. You have a statement, if A, then B, and then you decide to say, well, then if B, then A. Now, obviously, that's absolute nonsense. If dogs are likely to have 4 legs, it does not follow that something with 4 legs is likely to be a dog. However, this is the exact logic that people make when they start to propose solutions. They look at the fact that a lot of criminals tend to be poor, and then they deduce irrationally that poverty must be the problem, and you have to focus on fixing poverty in order to solve crime. However, there's simply nothing about the fact that a lot of criminals tend to be poor that suggests a causal relationship. And when you start to look across groups, it just all falls apart. Now, it's also important to think about this not just in terms of offenders, but also victims, because overwhelmingly, if somebody's murdered, it's likely to be somebody in their own group. That's true for whites, Hispanics, and Asians. It's exceptionally true for blacks, 90+%. If you look at the cause of death by homicide rate from December 2020, the black-white disparity was roughly 16-fold, but the black-Asian disparity was nearly 56-fold. Not only do Asians commit less crimes, but they're also less victims of crimes because it's not going on, it's not tolerated within their communities. In New York City in 2024, poverty rates were very similar for blacks, Asians, and Hispanics, yet violent crime arrests diverged like crazy. Asians had the lowest rate, 16 times fewer arrests for violent crimes than blacks. Now, there are going to be people that see the argument against poverty or economic circumstances as a driving force for crime, and they look at the numbers in the black community being as high as they are and say, well, duh, racism. But that argument has to hinge on A, an assumption that blacks face some type of systemic discrimination that Hispanics and Asians don't, and B, that it is so powerful that it can create a 16x multiplier for violent arrests between blacks and Asians. With economics, I don't know what the level of poverty is. For me to say that robbery, murder, or rape is like a reasonable conclusion, Similarly with racism, I don't know how much racism you have to experience for this to be the kind of shoulder shrug like, well, what do you expect? I will freely say that blacks are the most disadvantaged racial group in the United States. But one of the reasons you're that disadvantaged is because you're 56 times more likely to get murdered than one of the other racial groups. And over 90% of those murders are going to be from somebody who looks like you. Now, there's another problem with the appeal to discrimination, and that's that it is chosen very selectively. It is cherry-picked on the spot. And a great example of that is the fact that 98% of the people on death row are in fact men. Now, if any obvious sign of disparity that exists on a graph is an automatic sign of some systemic inequality that has to be addressed at the level of the institutions, one must, you don't have a choice, you have to then consider that 98% of men being on death row, that men being 93% of the prison population, is a byproduct of some deep-rooted systemic misandry. Where are my wealthy donors at? I need some paid protesters. I need some professionally made signs that are all color coordinated. We need to go schedule a march. We are not going to stand, men, for this oppression. We have been overrepresented in prisons for far too long. Well, if there's one thing that's going to combine more leftist and more conservative viewpoints, it should be that no shit, there's a lot of men in prison. There's a lot of men that are committing all of the fucking crimes. In traits like aggression, there's a small persistent difference about the mean. And that's one of the reasons that we can pretty much get along in modern society. But small differences about the mean result in large differences at the tail end of the bell curve. We've already covered that the overwhelming majority of crime is from a very small group of people. So those are going to be the ones that are shifted further away. And that is also why no matter what, if you ever come across a girl, no matter how cute or attractive she is, and she has spent any amount of time in police custody, you fucking run away. Because for men, cycling through the criminal justice system represents, unfortunately, a bigger chunk. But to be a woman and get arrested and end up in jail, you have to be all the way out there. You have to be like the craziest of the crazy. Aside from all these examples, you just have to know that economic status is not a predictor of crime. You can't look at somebody or even a group of people and see their economic status and confidently know that criminal behavior is going to follow. When you repeat something like poverty is correlated with crime or inequality is correlated with crime, you are instilling in people a belief that some criminal tendency is distributed across all people in this demographic, which is not just wrong, there are a whole bunch of really strong negative downstream consequences of spreading that narrative. The overwhelming majority of people in poverty anywhere in the world, but also in the US, don't commit fucking crimes. And to combine those two things together, criminal behavior and poverty, is to do a disservice to the people who end up being victims of crimes in those communities. It is the single mothers that are working multiple jobs to try and make it by. It's parents trying to keep their kids from ending up as another statistic in some local gang or have their daughters end up in trouble, pregnant as a teenager, and on and on. People in those situations trying to do the best that they can get looked over for the sake of building up criminals as just a tragic victim of an unfair system. I don't know how long I'm committed to this bit because it feels weird not to hold it up now, but I don't want to have to do this for every video. I did it at first because I thought it was funny, but also I'm not sure I can trust the average YouTube commenter to read between the lines and figure out the difference between data and editorial opinion. Not you though, it's those other commentators. You're good in my book. Now there are still people around who dare challenge the status quo in sociology and will look to things besides the environment and besides power structures to explain criminal behavior. Per Olaf H. Wikström, criminologist, that develops situational action theory. And it moves away from looking at the person, why the person commits crime, to looking at crime as an act and trying to figure out why this act occurs. And in doing so, the variables that he came up with included the criminogenic setting, the likelihood a setting might be ripe for somebody doing a crime, but also the propensity of the individual to commit crime. By removing the person out of it, he ironically ended up just re-deriving the trait of the individual as being an obvious driver of crime. So his work directly challenges a structuralist, environmentalist views of like strain theory, which is like, hey, your culture values these goals, you don't have the resources to get it, so now you're out in public beating people. And it instead shows that personal morals and things like impulse control, self-regulation, executive functioning are actually really big explainers to why crime happens, far more than the socioeconomic status of the offenders. And you don't even have to believe in objective morality. It's not about that. It's about what the person believes, the stories they tell themselves, what their viewpoint is of right and wrong and their role in the world. What he finds is that socially disadvantaged youth who offend tend to have both higher crime propensity and, unsurprisingly, more exposure to those criminogenic settings. This isn't groundbreaking shit, and I'm not even gonna hold up the fucking paddle because I think this is just common goddamn sense. If Jenny over here is poor and you're asking what are the odds that Jenny is gonna go do a crime, it stands to reason that you would just take a ratio of the number of criminals out of the entire poor category, and you're gonna say, oh, pretty small percent chance that I think Jenny is a criminal. But if you take her sister Sally and you say, hey, we studied Sally and she has low morals, a high sense of entitlement, low impulse control, she walks around with a chip on her shoulder and might have a personality disorder, I'm going to say that the odds of a crime happening are going to go up quite a bit. And folks, this cuts to how we view scientific models. The entire purpose of a model is to give you some predictive ability over the outcome. And there are a lot of things that we can look at that give us that predictability. However, pundits, politicians, professors in college overwhelmingly repeat an inversion of what every bit of data says on the subject. And they don't just repeat, they say it in a moralizing tone that suggests there's no room to even question lest you out yourself as a bad person. Every person, every movement, every ideology has the ability to go to this dark place where all of your ideas about the world are really just you acting as an ant, feeling around the other ants with your antenna to see what's tolerated, what you can get away with, what you can say. And you'll intuitively move towards things that are going to get you rewarded and higher status and move away from things that are going to get you reprimanded or outcast. This has happened in conservative circles. There's a reason we still read Nathaniel fucking Hawthorne.
It appears that we've cornered ourselves a witch.
However, each period of time, it seems that different groups tend to really master the art of this dysfunctional type of social ideology building. And right now, I'm going to say leftist ideologues are killing it. This brings us to, as the book Criminal Naivete described brilliantly, the great inversion. Everything we've done so far paints a pretty clear picture of crime, especially violent crime. Most of it's committed by very, very few people, and that's even within each demographic or social strata you can look at. The behavior patterns of these people often start very young and they persist with little variance over time. Just like any alcoholic or addict, rehab, if it's even possible, is extremely hard to do, takes a very long time, and then you have to ask yourself how much damage is society supposed to incur while this person's figuring it out. It blows apart the narrative that people are accidentally ending up in penitentiaries, and it shows that second chances aren't second chances, they are literally 15th, 20th, and 30th chances. I know I myself would be 100% on board for interventions, for rehab, for more services if there was any measurable correlation of those services going up and crime going down. But part of this inversion is the insistence that we go that route, even though the advocates of rehab and community support and reintegration don't have such outcomes literally anywhere. They are driving 100 miles an hour straight through a barrier on an engine fueled off nothing but vibes. Now, many people would reason that the evidence of violent offenders would merit a solution that emphasizes separating those predators from regular ass people, especially regular ass poor people, so that they have a greater chance of doing what they need to do to get by. But instead of that, we got a great inversion. Common among politicians, the media, activists, and academics, criminal naivete is a belief system that mischaracterizes criminal offenders in favor of an idealized, romanticized version. The idealized narrative is one where criminals are portrayed in almost heroic terms as victims, and the justice system, and by extension society at large, are portrayed as offenders forever saddled with public distrust and animosity. For those in denial, the realities of crime and criminal offenders are variously offensive, uncomfortable, and unsettling, so they are reconfigured to comport with their idealized, distorted image. Intentional or not, it is an inversion of moral order. We have reached an inflection point, one that philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche described, where our culture has become so pathologically soft and tender that, among other things, it sides even with those who harm it, criminals, and does this quite seriously and honestly. So you have progressives like Marilyn Mosby and Larry Krasner, people that came in with an explicit purpose of imposing bail reform, making it easier for people who are arrested to get back on the street, doing things like reducing mandatory minimum sentences, fighting against things like 3 strikes laws, which acknowledge that repeat criminals are a problem and need to be kept away from the general public as long as possible. So we've covered the history of criminology. We've covered what leftists specifically believe. We've poured over the data. But what is causing this great inversion? Criminal naivete was the inspiration for this video. One of the main purposes of the book is to answer why so many people are following through on this great inversion, and they give 5 concise reasons. The first 2 reasons have to do with individual experience, what the believer, the naive, actually went through that frames how they view other people in other circumstances. The first is limited exposure to behavioral variance, and the second is limited experience with the actual justice system. As the book states, one of the greatest luxuries of American life is insulation from serious offenders. Now, I've lived on every which side of the tracks. I went to school in 5 different states. I graduated high school in San Diego, but I went to junior college in San Bernardino, and there was quite a difference in behavior. And I quickly realized in college that I was going to, on a weekly basis, experience behavior that I would just never in my life think of seeing in the place where I went to high school. Now, that's a neat little anecdote, I know, and it doesn't prove anything. But I have observed, as so many others have over and over and over, that people with really strong opinions on things like violent crimes have never been within 10 square miles of a place where this type of behavior goes on a regular basis. I owned a gym right off the freeway in San Bernardino next to a major homeless tent encampment and saw the goings on day to day. I ran a behavioral health group out of my gym. I've existed in spaces where it's not uncommon to see a teacher threatened by a student, and I also existed in spaces where nobody could conceive of such a thing. So it stands to reason when you see somebody like Emma Vineland talking about crime, denying it top to bottom like a good leftist idealist.
The same 300 people in New York City represent 1/3 of the shoplifting arrests total for a single year.
Probably because
This
they're
is because they're
incredibly
repeat offenders.
impoverished and they need to find a way to actually sustain their livelihoods in this country.
It's obvious that she has never existed in these spaces. She's never seen somebody beamed upside the head with a golf club at a party because of some petty nonsense. She hasn't worked at a business that was robbed at gunpoint. And she certainly hasn't spent many hours going down the YouTube body cam rabbit hole. Because once again, once anybody spends a certain amount of time on that fun little activity, you're gonna have a really, really hard time defending these viewpoints the same exact way. Now, in addition to that, people on average have very, very limited exposure with the actual justice system. Consider you and everybody you know. What has been the average exposure? Getting pulled over for a traffic ticket once every 2 years? Proximity that exists between so many of these intellectuals and the actual field that they're trying to describe allows them to fill in the gaps of their knowledge with oversimplifications from reductionist ideologies without ever having to reconcile what people actually observe in real time with the shit that they're spouting. And what makes me mad about that is twofold. One, that they advocate for policies that directly create more harm in the communities that they're trying to protect.
But every single study that's been done of policing, whether you're talking about investments in policing, additional hires, expansions of patrols, hotspots policing, proactivity measures, they all show crime declines as a result. Now, who benefits from those crime declines? If you look at the homicide decline between 1990 and 2014, that decline added a full year of life expectancy to the average black man's life in this country. It only added 0.14 years of life expectancy to the average white man's life in this country. The public health equivalent of that is to eliminate obesity as a disease.
But two, that they get to actually paint themselves in front of their social groups and their peers as being good people. They get the benefit of being seen as kind while they actively deconstruct this environment that they never have to actually see or participate in. They get to spout stories about mass incarceration being a problem when about 1.7% of the population, about 5.5 million Americans, are somehow involved as subjects in the criminal justice system, despite the fact that 10% of the population are going to be life course persistent offenders, and the dark figure of crime doesn't even have a 10% accounting of all of the crime that's actually been prosecuted. Even with serious shit like homicide, most major cities might get like a 40% clearance rate, meaning they actually have a conviction. Most murders go unsolved. So given that most of that 1.7% aren't actually incarcerated. They're free, they're on probation or parole, they're out in the community. How well does it hold up that there is in fact a thing called mass incarceration? That only works if you think the default of every single one of 330 million Americans is the exact same, and it would only deviate if the system did something to them. And that has absolutely no fucking bearing in reality. Sorry. Now, the next three factors that criminal naivete proposes have to do with the actual ideology. One, they follow an ideology that denies individual level pathology in favor of structural explanations. And this is where you get to fun shit like blank slate environmentalism, which was obsolete in the field of psychology like centuries ago. I'm not even gonna insult your intelligence by explaining why that's fucking stupid. I have a dog, my dog does dog shit without having to have seen other dogs do dog shit because it's hardwired in DNA. We've done twin studies. We know not just about genetics, but epigenetics. It's ever nature or nurture, they're both. And we know the coefficient, the influence that comes from a genetic trait as it predicts how somebody's going to behave in their life, especially with regards to pathology. And let me just grant you that it is entirely structural. If you do not have the ability to change those structures, if you're limited in your ability to rehab or course correct, or if people don't respond to job placement programs, which they fucking don't, it brings us right back to the question of how much society as a whole is supposed to suffer and make themselves martyrs in favor of your desire to do it just the one right way you want to do it that you think is just. At some point, people have to be able to figure it the fuck out if they want to coexist with other people. And if you're so far off that you can't, not without doing a little stabbing or a little shooting, then society is well within their right to preserve themselves. The second ideological tentpole is that they have an exaggerated belief in potential behavioral change. And that cuts to what I just said. They think that words like rehab actually mean something, and they don't. They spout off these fairy tales about throwing more money at systems that might give more halfway houses, it might give more programs. At the fringe, that might make a difference. There are people that are not pathological repeat offenders that can have their life go one way or another, but they aren't responsible for the overwhelming majority of the violence that we see. So given that they try to take things that are appropriate for that population and smear it over the most pathological, the most persistent, it is that exaggerated belief that forces people to accept real true blue predators into their communities. And the third and final one is that they exist in an echo chamber. Now we are all logged into the algorithm. We all have our own echo chamber, and that's why we need to start valuing dissenting opinions and real arguments, as long as they're not just like emotional outbursts. You're a fucking idiot. But for a group of people that love the term systemic and institutional, as it stands right now, there is no group of people that benefit more from systemic and institutional insulation from ideas that are hard to deal with than the left working in academia. I mean, it was bad when I went to a four-year university, and that was like 20 years ago, and it's only gotten worse since. The echo chamber in academia, it's not just people that believe the same thing, giving each other backslaps and being like, good point. It is a strong social network that gives direct incentive to follow along with the assumptions that are being held up as truth, and gives very, very aggressive punishment for not even just going against them, but for questioning. Anybody who's ever had a bad experience at Sunday school. I went to an Adventist school for a couple of years, asked one too many questions during the science portion. They did not like that. I was not met with the same care and attention as I would be in like a math or physics class. If I didn't understand something, it's more in the vein of, you're fucking up my lesson, kid. How about you shut up and just nod? Anybody who's ever asked one too many questions in a sociology classroom probably has experienced something similar, because their beliefs are formed in a system where everybody tends to go along with the same vague talking points as absolute moral certainties. They're not used to being questioned so much, which means they are not prepared with the mag clip filled with a bunch of different statistics and case studies that serve as the ammunition that's going to mow down their worldview. We have young people with no experience who are eager to please, and we throw them into this intense social dynamic at a very vulnerable and impressionable part of their lives, with all of those incentives to go for and not against, to attend rallies, to get the thumbs up from your immediate peer group, to get the number of that blue-haired chick. You want to get the acknowledgement, the nod from your professors and your other socially conscious friends. And so aggressive are these social pressures on the minds of young college students that they don't simply ignore data within the field. They aggressively and confidently make truth statements about other fields of which they have no actual experience in. Every sociology class is going to have very aggressive assertions about what is true regarding things that they haven't directly studied, but fields like biology and psychology have for the last few centuries. And without having any knowledge of what that data is or how it might support or contradict what the sociologists found out, they're perfectly fine saying, no, this is the way it is. Now, this ultimately leads to policies from progressives that aim to do something about crime. They say it's to solve crime, but usually it's to say that they're doing something to get the voters off their back until the next election cycle. So right at the height of the 2020 moral panic, everybody's chanting defund the police. The police are evil, criminals are, misunderstood. You got people like Chesa Boudin who came in and made campaign statements that framed offenders as victims of socioeconomic conditions. He then made policies that reduced prosecutions for theft and property crime. You remember how that went? You remember the endless stream of videos of people brazenly running in and shoplifting shit from Walmart?
Because they're
Incredibly
repeat offenders.
impoverished.
Anybody who's lived or worked in a bad area knows what the grocery store's locked up, all right? And it's not the essential goods. They're not locking up the fucking bread and milk. They're locking up the alcohol, they're locking up the apparel, they're locking up the electronics. It was rampant brazen theft, mainly from youths in a culture that enables that type of behavior and explains it away, that actually ran some of these businesses out of the city. You have policymakers like AOC who had this gem. Maybe this has to do with the fact that people aren't paying their rent and are scared to pay their rent, and so they go out and they need to feed their child and they don't have money, so they feel like either they need to shoplift some bread or go hungry. To AOC, this is the face of crime. No different than when Gavin Newsom tried to say the face of homelessness was like a single mom that just got fired from her job. These are only mischaracterizations if you accept the person saying them is an actual fucking retard who has no information about the subject. If they are in fact educated and intelligent, then the best you can say is that they are bold-faced manipulative lies. And from all of this, I hope you got a bit of insight, not just in the history of crime and where these ideas come from, but in the specific way that it develops to where criminals prey on the people in their own vulnerable communities. Because if you're looking at these policymakers as bad people, it shouldn't just be because leftist or progressive bad. It should be because they, as individuals who are putting their hands in the machinery, are making changes that we can tangibly measure, make things worse for the very people that they're trying to save. And the only way that that's going to stop happening is if as many people as possible are exposed to the details in no uncertain terms. So let me know what you think. Was this enlightening? Am I an idiot? Did I misrepresent a whole bunch of shit and I should never make a video like this ever again in my life? No matter what type of comment you make, I'm probably gonna argue with you about something in the comments, so I'll see you there. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.